Hey everybody, and welcome to another installment of board games I got rid of and why. So in this series I take a look at some board games that I've previously owned in my own collection but for one reason or another no longer do, and I tried to give some rationale as to why I came to the decision to part with them. Now before I get into these 10 games, I want to give a shout out to the show's sponsor, KIENDA.co.uk, who are my go-to online retailer when it comes to purchasing board games here in the UK, and if you use my link in the show notes or the QR code, then you can get 5% off your first order. The first game I'm talking about is muntu. Now this is a pretty straightforward abstract strategy game as you are skipping around this grid of these rather nice plastic animal tiles and trying to collect them, because if you collect the majority of certain sets you'll get more points. But the twist on this game was that these animals, not only did they move in different ways when you landed on them on the board, which means you could plan turns ahead and try to manipulate the board to benefit you to get the animals you exactly want, but it also meant that you could manipulate the board state and what all these animals are worth. So for example, at the start of the game the elephants might be worth the most, but as the players manipulate that board state, maybe the monkeys will be worth the most at the end. So you always have to be aware of that, and hopefully that the animals that you're investing in aren't going to slip too far down the scoreboard. Now I thought the game worked well for what it was. It certainly had a certain charm to it, very nice to look at. But I thought the game was slightly one note. I think there's a glass ceiling on how many times you could play this one and enjoy it. And I also thought there's a little bit of imbalance here, because there was an alternative way to collect points by collecting these masks, which would score you points based on a sliding scale. And I always thought that was a really strong incentive to get those, because the weighting of the scores or the points you could get seemed to outweigh that of collecting other things. So I also thought that was a dominant strategy if you let someone run away with it. But it was fine, it's just not quite my cup of tea. And despite playing it, probably 5 to 8 times, I thought that, my time had come to an end with it, and I didn't really have the desire to go back and play it any further. The next game I'm talking about is Meadow. So Meadow is kind of this little tableau building game as you're playing cards out in front of you, and the better and better these cards get, the more prerequisites they need based on things you've already played. For me, this game kind of is a sign of the times really, because this last couple of years there's been a ton of these kind of gateway plus level games that have a beautiful visual appeal to them. And this one has lovely kind of watercolour animal and wildlife pictures on them. And for me, that did kind of trump and supersede the actual gameplay itself, because the gameplay here was quite standard and quite vanilla for me. It did feel like a ton of other games out there, and I think it's been propped up to a level that doesn't quite relate to the actual gameplay, simply because it looks so nice. So maybe I'm missing something here, but I definitely didn't feel that this game was anything special. I didn't really feel the desire to explore it any further. Maybe the expansion material added more, but for me, yeah, it just felt like I was doing the same thing from start to finish. I also felt like the game went on a little bit too long at those lower player counts, because I remember playing a 2-player game on this and I thought you could have easily shaved a round or 2 off and you still would have had the same experience. So yeah, maybe I'm not the right market for this one, but I certainly didn't quite understand why it got so popular. So that is Meadow. Next up we have Point Salad. So I actually am quite a fan of this simple card drafting game as you're collecting these vegetables and trying to tailor them towards these objective cards. Next to no rules overhead in this one, and of course you are sharing a communal pool of cards with the other players, meaning that sometimes the cards you want are going to get taken from you before you get your chance to have your turn. That's pretty much the extent of the game. You're just trying to get as much points as you can. Some of these cards are going to work against you, some are going to work with you, and it's all about trying to get the maximum benefit and output from each card that you draft. It literally takes around 10 minutes to play, so it certainly is that true filler game, the quintessential filler. Now for me, despite really liking this one and not having much bad to say about it, I never really found myself leaning to pull it off the shelf, and I'd normally reach for something maybe with a little bit more meat on the bones. And I also thought a slight thing working against this one was that when you scaled this to different player counts, you had to mess with the deck of cards quite a bit, which would add more setup time, and that could become a bit of an obstacle to get this onto the table, especially considering how light and simple it was. But I believe my friend still got a copy of this one, so we can still play it any time. And maybe one day I will get this one back into the collection, because I actually think it does a great job of doing what it does. But yeah, ultimately, I never really found myself picking it up amongst other fillers out there. So that is Point Salad. Next up, I have Mr. Cabbage Head's Garden. So this is a weird looking game, has some of the quirkiest artwork that I've seen probably ever, but this is like a puzzly game as you're playing these cards out in certain patterns and formations on the table in front of you. Tons of games do this, but this one was maybe somewhat more restricted because it was only for 1 or 2 players. Now, if you watch my content regularly, you might have noticed that I'm not a huge solo gamer. In fact, I very rarely play solo games. But this one, I could certainly see the appeal of it as you're managing these bees, which are going to dictate which cards you can draft at any time, and you're trying to put these cards out as optimally as you can. But the twist on this one was that every so often these kind of neighbours would come out and bother you and mess with your puzzle. And you do that by flipping over these random tokens, which will give you an idea but not a concrete evidence of what is going to happen next. And I tend to like games that have this threat that works against you. Some of my favourite games has that mechanism, such as Peloponnese and Scylla, but those games do it better than this one does, and of course those are multiplayer games. So I had this on my shelf for quite a long time, thinking there's bound to be a time when I want to play a simple little puzzly game by myself, and that time very rarely happened. So I enjoyed my few plays of this one, but am I going to go back and play it anymore? Probably not. So yeah, that's why I parted with Mr. Cabbagehead's Garden. Next up, I have Steam Time. So I actually really like the idea of this worker placement game where you actually build the worker placement spots yourselves, or the other players do, as the game develops. And you can make these really creative and really powerful spots that are inviting to the other players. Now, the issue I had with this game was that because so many of these spots are being built by the players, it's quite overwhelming and difficult to keep tabs on what all these spots do, because the tiles were quite small and the iconography wasn't great, and again, a little bit overwhelming. And I tend to prefer games where I can see all my options at a glance and I don't always have to kind of recalibrate each round and have a look everywhere to see what my optimal move was. So I thought some of the actual practicality of this game took away from the experience, but the game itself was pretty decent. But those issues I had with it were enough for me to not want to play it anymore, because of course we are spoiled for choice nowadays. So that's why I decided to part with Steam Time. Next up, I have Last Will, which is another worker placement game, and this is a Vladimir Suki design, and if you know me, you might know I'm a huge fan of his games. This one might be one of the nearest misses that I've ever kind of not added to my collection, and I love the idea of this one as you start with a ton of money and the objective is to try and burn through that money as quickly as possible, and you're going to do that by making tons of really poor investments, by hiring people, by buying property high, selling it low. All these kind of things have some very cool thematic ties here, and that was almost enough for me to keep this one around. Now, I thought this game was slightly a bit light in terms of what I like from worker placement games. Now, I think the worker placement genre is so saturated that I tend to enjoy worker placement games when they have a little bit more meat on the bones and are a little bit more complex than this one was. And ultimately, the reason why I got rid of this one was because I have so many worker placement games that this one would simply, or just by default, be quite far down that pecking order, and I only want to have physical games in my collection that I know I want to play and will play relatively soon. So unfortunately, this was simply a victim of having too much competition, so that's why I got rid of Last Will. Next up, I have 10, which is a push your luck and set collection game where you're playing cards in front of you, trying not to go bust by going over a certain value, or of course you can stop and collect those cards in front of you, trying to create runs of numbers. I quite like games like that. I tend to enjoy push your luck games. For me, this game tried a bit too hard and reached too far to be different and added one too many mechanisms in that took it out of that really accessible level. Like, for example, every now and then these wild cards would come up and they would instantly stop the game and break the flow completely, and then you'd go into this kind of auction phase where you'd spend these tokens you collected to acquire those cards. For me, that felt really jarring and unnecessary and actually hindered the experience. So it goes to show sometimes less is more. And another example where there are so many great push your luck games out there, this one was a good one, but those things just made it, just took it to a level that I wasn't really willing to explore any further, because I'm always going to reach towards games that I know are bankers and people are always going to enjoy and always going to be more engaged with, because with games this punchy and this that are supposed to be exciting, you don't want to keep on being frustrated by the game, keep stalling by going into an auction phase. And unfortunately, that was enough for me not to want to keep 10 around anymore. The next game I'm talking about is Lancelot, which I'm sad to say was straight up boring. I did not like this design at all, as you are travelling around this rather cool looking board and collecting pieces of weaponry and armour, and then trading them into complete missions essentially. Now that's pretty much the gist of the game, but there was a cool concept or two in this one where you were somewhat incentivized to make it around this rondel as quickly as possible and reserve your spots, because as long as you were there and other people were still taking their turns, you could generate points, which I thought was really cool and could have been exploited further. Now unfortunately this is one of those games I thought you could get too much done, where like if you're going to do one thing now, somebody else will probably do it later, and it just felt like you were doing a lot of work at times to get next to no points in return. So it felt like you were jumping through a lot of hoops and not ever getting any excitement or really feeling the game of this one. So yeah, I thought it was purely mechanical, and it really did struggle to reach and find where the fun and where the game was. So yeah, big miss for me. That is Lancelot. The next game I'm talking about is Merlin, and I do so with quite a heavy heart because I am a big fan of the game itself. In this game you are rolling a bunch of dice and you're allocating them to move these pieces around this rondel. You're collecting items, completing objectives, fighting off these threats. You know, a real point salad style game as you'd expect with a Feld design. Now you might ask, if I like the game so much, why did I get rid of it from my collection? And that is because to get the optimal experience with this game, you had to pick and choose from a bunch of different expansions and a bunch of different modules. And that made the setup time a real pain. It made it a big obstacle to tear the game down. It made referencing rules really difficult because, again, you'd have so many different pieces of the game from different expansions that it wasn't a quick glance you could go and find rules that you were looking for. And all those things added up to make it a game that I never really felt like pulling off the shelf and filtering through. So sadly, I think this was a victim of its own bloat, which was, a bit of a sad thing for me to say because, I love stuff in Feld games. So yeah, unfortunately, as my time with the hobby has come along and in time, my tolerance for these things is next to nothing now, and I want my games to be a bit more intuitive and I can just play without having to reference so many things. And I don't want to spend as much time setting up a game as I am going to play it. So sadly, for all those reasons, I had to pass on, or had to part with Merlin. And the final game I'm talking about today is Ominos, which is a dice-driven abstract game, as all the players have their own face of a die that they are trying to put together in groups essentially. So you're trying to align 4 dice of your colour together in order to get a certain amount of points. However, you can only ever move pieces that you roll with a new dice new die that's added each round. And what that meant was that sometimes you would not roll your own face, of course, and that would mean you'd have to move dice belonging to other players. And the choices because of that were really obvious, where if you rolled someone else's dice, then you were obviously going to start separating their pieces. If you roll your own, you're going to bring them together. And that was pretty much the extent of the game. There was no real interesting decisions to be made, and it became quite frustrating at times when you might not even have any of your own pieces on the board and you were just completely out of options. So I thought it had a certain charm to it. It was a bit of a throwback, but the gameplay itself was pretty weak, to be honest. And obviously, for that reason, I could not keep it around. So there we have it. That's another 10 board games that have left my collection. Hopefully the rationale and the explanation to these games has given you a better idea as to why I decided to part with them. Apologies, there's been a bit of a break in between this video and the last one of the series, but I'll be looking to make this more regular going forward. If you have enjoyed the video, please be sure to hit like and subscribe to my channel and check out my other content too. And for everybody else, I'll see you next time on Chairman of the Board. Bye bye.